Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Sunday, March 17th, 2024, and today we are going to be talking about the Democratic Party and their meddling in the 2024 Ohio Senate GOP primary that is set to take place this coming Tuesday. The state of Ohio is one that has been in a point of contention when it comes down to our 2024 Senate elections, largely because there is an incumbent Democrat here, Senator Sherrod Brown, who has served in this seat for years now, who's up for re-election alongside the same presidential ballot that Donald Trump is on. And with Donald Trump's large lead in the state of Ohio presently, Republicans are hopeful that Donald Trump will help carry some of the Republicans across the finish line in congressional races, in the Senate race, and other down-ballot races that could determine the future of the state and, of course, the future of the country. But with Donald Trump's 10-point lead in the state of Ohio, we have found here that Sherrod Brown leads every single Republican opponent when it comes down to a head-to-head matchup amongst the same electorate. For instance, in the most recent poll that we've seen from Survey USA showing Donald Trump with a 12-point lead and The Hill and Emerson College that shows Donald Trump with a 10-point lead, there are plenty of polls here that show Sherrod Brown, the incumbent Democrat, with an advantage amongst those same groups. For instance, against Matt Dolan, one of the potential Republican nominees, Sherrod Brown leads by 3 in both polls. Against Bernie Moreno, another potential GOP nominee, Sherrod Brown leads by 6 and 5. And then against Frank LaRose, the incumbent Secretary of State of Ohio, Sherrod Brown leads by 8 and 6. And so you can see here that there are heavy worries amongst the Republican Party, looking at the state of Ohio as a state that might otherwise be very favorable for them if it wasn't for the case of the Senate race. And Republicans now being in the majority that is so exceptionally narrow in the House, they are looking to win back control of the Senate, which also Democrats have an extremely narrow majority, their narrowest they have seen in quite some time, besides their 50-50 split that they had for just around 2 years, which we can see here, Republicans are looking to take full control with a trifecta in the event that Donald Trump wins the election. Now, looking at Ohio, too, from a lens outside of the Senate races, we can look back at the 2020 presidential election and the 2016 presidential election. Now, prior to these, when Barack Obama had won these states, it had never been more by around 5 points. It was 5 points in 2008, and it was 3 points in 2012. But 2016 was a turning point. Ohio, which had long had Democratic governors and multiple Democratic senators, and in some cases, a Democratic delegation in the House of Representatives, had become an extremely Republican state compared to it where it had been in the past. From 2012 to 2016, the state of Ohio swung by over 11 points to the right, giving Donald Trump a victory over Hillary Clinton by 8.1%. Fast forward to 2020, despite making major moves in the Midwestern region of the United States, with Joe Biden flipping back Michigan and Wisconsin and locking down Minnesota, Ohio shifted by just 0.1%. It was minimal, and voters actually increased their percentage in voting for Donald Trump in this election. And so looking at where we are in 2024, of course, the presidential matchup is looking to be very, very similar. But Democrats are actually aligning themselves largely with where President Trump is in backing one particular candidate. And it seems to be intentional. Now, before we get into this, I want to give you a preface as to what this actually means when I say Democrats are meddling in a Senate primary. It goes all the way back to the 2022 midterm elections when Democrats had a surprisingly strong victory when it came down to the House elections, the Senate elections, the governor elections. All across the country, Democrats were significantly outperforming their expectations, and a lot of it had to do with one thing: candidate quality. And that happened because Democrats used their money and used their advantage to meddle not only in these primaries, but also in the general election season. What that meant was that Democrats decided to back Republicans in far-right positions, right? Republicans that had taken up positions on the GOP spectrum that were far out of reach from what the average median voter would agree with. They did this in swing states like Pennsylvania and Georgia and Arizona, and in many instances, it actually paid off. Republicans were quick to reject this from Democrats, saying that it was unfair that Democrats were interfering in this election. Some from the left even said that they were putting the own country at risk and their own party at risk by involving themselves in this electoral process, because what it did was built this idea that Democrats were able to just move into a Republican primary and put out ads for a particular Republican in hopes that they would win the nomination. But evidently, it worked, because looking at many of these competitive Senate races, I can't help but thinking, would these Republicans have won these nominations without the help of Democrats? In a lot of cases, the answer is probably not. Think about a state like Pennsylvania, where Democrats were very, very strong in this showing. Governor Josh Shapiro ended up defeating Doug Mastriano by roughly 15 percentage points across the state. You know who funded a lot of his ads? Democrats for Doug Mastriano. Democrats that were out there saying that Doug Mastriano was too extreme, to make America great again for the public, to Trump for the public. But it was the way that they did this in the primary season that actually made Republicans more excited to vote for Doug Mastriano. Think about it from this lens. Democrats are out here telling you that they're worried about one Republican because they're too conservative. They're too strong in their Republican values. Republicans look at that and say, I want this guy. I want this person, right? I want them to be the nominee for Senate, for House, for governor. And it's a perfect way of them taking some of the more far-right candidates, and they did this in 9 states with tens of millions of dollars. I mean, you're talking a huge chunk of cash being spent on amplifying these candidates. And eventually, it did pay off. What we found here was that when it came down to the Senate races where Democrats spent money on people like Herschel Walker, people like Blake Masters, people like Dr. Oz, Democrats were able to do well there. Is it safe to say that Republicans would have lost these seats, regardless, without Democratic meddling? No. But it's neither safe to say that they would have won them without meddling, right? None of this is a perfect science, but what we do know is that there are movements in polls when it comes down to Democratic interference. Because in most cases, the average voter cannot tell it's the Democratic Party. It's not as if they sign off every ad by saying the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee is responsible for this message. More often, they'll disguise themselves as PACs that seem conservative, that'll promote these further right candidates, and eventually drag them down in the general election because the primary voters love it, but the general election voters simply do not. And so now this time, Democrats are uniting with Donald Trump. Now, obviously, this isn't some type of, intentional effort from either side of the aisle to work together on this front. But Democrats are looking at what the polling numbers are telling us, and the polling numbers are telling us that the likeliest candidate to win the GOP nomination is Bernie Moreno compared to Frank LaRose, and their polling numbers are roughly the same. Frank LaRose, honestly, would be the best person that they could put up in this position to lose the eventual election, but I will say that he's in a statewide position. He knows how to run a statewide race. He runs all of the elections. But his association with Ohio Issue 1 and his association with different policy positions that are unpopular amongst Ohio residents is a little bit more well-known than it is amongst Bernie Moreno. But this is a sleeper race here. Because what we are finding is that Matt Dolan, although not receiving the endorsement from President Trump and not seeing him come to Ohio to support him, seems to be the most electable candidate and the least scandal-plagued. The opposition research has been going strong against Bernie Moreno, and that's because Republicans are worried about him winning this nomination. What we just saw released was that Bernie Moreno might have been implicated and linked to an adult dating profile for gay men. He's a married man to a woman, and this is something that you are now starting to see attacks from Republican opponents in this Senate race that Donald Trump and his campaign are trying to combat, even going down to Ohio yesterday, holding a rally at which now has received a lot of national attention, not for the reason of the Ohio Senate race, but a reason that we will talk about later on in this week in another video. But looking at where Donald Trump has been really getting involved here, he really wants it to be Bernie Moreno. He endorsed him very early on, and this was a race that was supposed to be one that was easily winnable for Moreno, easily, with Donald Trump being on the ballot with him. But we will see what happens here. But Democrats know. Democrats know that their best candidate for this race is him. Because as we've been talking about these same electorates that are electing Trump and Sherrod Brown, in some cases, it isn't a perfect science. The most recent poll that we have seen released is from East Carolina University. They do a bunch of polls across the country, but in Ohio they did for the top 3 Republicans against Sherrod Brown. And the only Republican here to defeat Sherrod Brown was Matt Dolan. And Democrats know this. Matt Dolan is not scandal-plagued. He doesn't come with heavy baggage. He doesn't come with all of these previous stances that could be used against him in the general election. That is not what is happening here. That is what is happening with Frank LaRose and Bernie Moreno. But looking at the Senate race, of course, this is up to the voters. But Democrats are trying to tilt the scale here by endorsing the Trump candidate in this race indirectly. You can watch some of these ads. I just saw one come across my Twitter feed here where Democrats are calling him, too MAGA, right? Too right wing, somebody who has, adopted President Trump's strengths and President Trump's proposals and wants to be a Trump surrogate when Donald Trump wins the election this November. That's the messaging. That is the strategy they are approaching here for 2024 and for this upcoming primary. And Democrats are doing this very, very last minute. They're pulling for them at a time at which you cannot see that much money from the Republican side really being funneled into this race. You are talking $3 to $4 million of ads hitting the airwaves, days before the election, backing this one candidate who Democrats are hopeful will eventually lose the election, because this is a strategy that they employed before. And they did so effectively, and they very well could do it again. And so now looking at our Senate races here, I think Democrats are also starting to realize that if it isn't Bernie Moreno when it comes down to Ohio, this race becomes a lot less winnable. Our country is at a point where there are so many competitive races all across, and Democrats are looking to really just play defense here. Republicans have so many opportunities for pickups looking at some of these states where Donald Trump won these states in 2016 and even in some cases 2020, that they could very well see Donald Trump and the Republicans winning in 2024 depending on what happens. States like Montana with an incumbent Democratic senator, states like Ohio with an incumbent Democratic senator, states like West Virginia with an incumbent Democratic senator. If you were just to characterize all of the states that Republicans currently hold, including these two states, West Virginia, Ohio, three states, West Virginia, Ohio, and Montana, the Senate majority would flip. Not to mention that Democrats are in a bit of a position here where Pennsylvania might become competitive last minute, Michigan might be competitive last minute, and Wisconsin. But what Democrats are hoping to counteract it is the fact that Republicans don't have the strongest candidates in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan, and that Montana may not go the Republican way, and that Ohio may be able to be held out by Democrats in 2024 if there is a lackluster GOP nominee. What they need here for this perfect storm that requires Democrats to get everything right. They need to be able to get every single thing right in Montana, in Ohio, in Pennsylvania, in Wisconsin, in Michigan, and it's something that has been done before. The way Democrats expanded their majority in 2022 was by playing their cards correctly. That's it. There's no major science to it. When Democrats backed these lackluster far-right extremist candidates in 2022, the voters rejected them. They didn't need to do further meddling in the general election other than the traditional style of campaigning. But what they did was gave Republicans the opportunity to choose somebody who is the least electable, not only when it came down to Senate races, not only governor races, but you can see it all across the board in many of these competitive House races. When you look at a state like Michigan, for instance, where Democrats were expected to have a competitive race on the Michigan 3rd District side, John Gibbs, he ran against Peter Meijer. Peter Meijer is also running for Senate in 2024. Democrats know that Peter Meijer is a more electable Republican. He was the Republican incumbent, and he was in this race as the incumbent who had been against Donald Trump. Moderate and independent voters liked that, but the right-wing voters simply did not. And so when John Gibbs was strapped for cash instead of the NRCC or Donald Trump's campaign or the Save America Pact coming into this to try to fund his campaign, Democrats did it for John Gibbs. And John Gibbs narrowly won that House primary and ended up losing the general election by 13 points. And this was the case all across the country. In New Hampshire's 1st District, Caroline Leavitt, who is now Trump's campaign press secretary for 2024, was very much seen as the more extremist and more, in Democrats' eyes, insane candidate. And so they backed her in the GOP primary. They funded her in the GOP primary, only for her to go on to lose by around 8 points. We saw this happen all across the country. And so when this was the problem for Republicans, that they were facing, extremist candidates, they were trying to backtrack. They were trying to make sure that these candidates, no matter how extreme, were able to ride what they thought was going to be a red wave year. And I think that's what Democrats are hoping Republicans will expect to do this time around, should Bernie Moreno win the nomination. But at the 11th hour, Republicans also involved themselves in this race. And you started to see a narrow but seemingly, significant increase for Matt Dolan that might actually land him the nomination, and Democrats might end up losing the Senate race because of this nomination process. And so Democrats are very much backing Bernie Moreno because they know this is the electable way to go. It's a big risk, but it could pay off very, very well. High risk, high reward. Democrats and Trump are aligned on one thing, and it's that they want Bernie Moreno to be the nominee for Senate in Ohio in 2024. But should Democrats lose this general election with Sherrod Brown at the top of the ticket, it will raise plenty of questions as to whether or not meddling actually does pay off. It may have seemed like it did in 2022, but at some point, it won't pay off. At some point, it will backfire. And Democrats will elect extremist and far-right candidates to the U.S. House, to the U.S. Senate, and they may have a heavy reevaluation of what they do when it comes down to GOP primaries. But as of right now, Democrats seem to be taking a page out of the playbook from 2022, an effective playbook that gave Democrats such a significant electoral performance contrary to what was expected. But it needs to perform well this time, otherwise maybe this will be completely abandoned for future elections. Only time will tell, though, as to what happens with Bernie Moreno, Matt Dolan, Frank LaRose. All of them seem to be candidates who, in theory, could lose to Sherrod Brown and are losing to him. But there is one candidate, Matt Dolan, who seems to be running ahead of the pack quite significantly and doing a lot better when it comes down to the election and the general election season. But Republican voters do not always take that into consideration, and it'd be kind of wrong to assume that the average voter does as well. The average voter isn't looking at Real Clear Politics and analyzing the polls from this sense. What they're voting on are scandals and things they hear and endorsements, and the one saving grace for Bernie Moreno that I think will give him this nomination, if I was to call it today, is that Donald Trump will be on the same exact ballot as him. And when Trump is stumping in Ohio for him, and voters get out there and remember that Trump endorsed Bernie Moreno, if they're filling him in for the presidential, they're probably filling in Bernie Moreno for the senatorial. Of course, we will see this coming Tuesday what happens in the state of Ohio, but right now Democrats are pulling for the same candidate that Donald Trump is, but not without reason because they know it gives them the upper hand this coming November. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, and then a playlist for my 2024 election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.